In 2026, every government from Washington to Beijing is obsessed with economic security. The stimulus packages, subsidies for semiconductors, fabs, and green energy mandates are pitched as the answer to volatility. Policymakers proudly announce that they have insulated their citizens from the cruel winds of the market. What they don't say is um, what these interventions really do. They compromise the market's immune system. I mean, the debate about stability at all costs forgets that capitalism's genius is its ability to adapt through failures. The Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter famously described this process uh, as a quote, a perennial gale of creative distraction. He argued that the constant opening of new markets and organizational innovation uh, in, uh, increasingly revitalize the economic structure from within, destroying the old one, creating a new one. The global push for um, permanence is trying to shut down the gale. So, but it's a paradox, right? I mean, an economy without recessions is like a body without a fever. It loses the ability to recognize and kill off pathogens. I mean, the Keynesian dream of fine tuning, aggregate demand promised that governments could keep the economy at full employment by adjusting spending, taxes, and money supply. Yet, even most Keynesians now admit that the state simply cannot know enough to micromanage the cycle. Recognitions of the lag, implementation lags, and response lags makes it most impossible. Those who insist on short circuiting downturns today are creating a world that's more fragile and less dynamic. They mistake volatility for failure and stability for strength. This is the doctrinal error we must interrogate. So, here I'm going to talk about why economic crises are not a failure of capitalism. They are the most vital part of its operating system. Crises purge inefficiencies, discipline bad actors, and free up capital and talent for the next generation of innovators. Suppressing them locks in monopolies, zombie companies, and unsustainable debt, breeding fragility. So I'm trying to tell you that you could understand why the West's obsession with permanent stability actually threatens to dismantle the immune system of the global economy, and why investors, historians, and leaders should welcome controlled downturns instead of fearing them. So, for 20 years, the dominant macroeconomic doctrine has been that the government can smooth out the business cycle. John Maynard Keynes, which I believe was a Satan, argued that aggregate demand is volatile and that activist fiscal and monetary policy is required to prevent high unemployment. By 1960s, policymakers spoke out of the fine-tuning the economy. Today, that has morphed into massive fiscal intervention whenever a dip appears. So, however, the fine-tuning myth ignores three realities, I believe. First, that's just information lags. The government doesn't know the state of the economy in real time. By the time data signals slow down, the private sector has already adjusted. As I'm entering into the Econolib encyclopedia notes, almost all economists now agree that makers cannot know enough soon enough to fine tune accessibility. So the second lag is implementation lags. Even when problems are recognized, there's a lag between the recognition and the implementation of the policy, right? The fiscal measures must pass political hurdles. Monetary policy acts faster, but it still takes months for interest rate change to filter through credit markets. And the third lags are their response lags. I mean, once implemented, policies take time to affect the real economy. These lags mean that stimulus often hits as the economy is already recovering, fueling inflation and asset bubbles. So the result is a system that suppresses small corrections and creating huge distortion. Bailouts and guarantees became routine. During the 2008 crisis, and again with the 2023 banking turmoil. Regulators guaranteed deposits and flooded markets with liquidity. Critics point out at that time that protecting large depositors weakens market discipline and elevates moral hazard. What's the moral hazard? In this case, it's the belief that government will always risk failing in institutions. So, a repeated risk you have hardwired these expectations, I would say, into financial markets. So, when investors expect government backstops, they take greater risks. Moral hazard is no longer a theoretical concern, it's a chronic disease. So government intervention also creates zombie firms, which are companies that can't service their debt without continuous support. These firms tie up workers and capital in low productivity uses. Japan's experience in the 1990s and parts of Europe after 2010 show that protecting corporate incumbents leads to stagnation and deflation. The metaphor of an immune system fits when you disable the fever response, like small recessions. You allow infectious responses, which are like unproductive firms and excessive leverage, to faster and to fester. So eventually, a systematic crisis like the 2008 crash becomes unavoidable. The Atlantic Council at that time notes that the repeated pacification of crisis by the central banks has morphed the financial system into one where crises are cooled by flooding markets with liquidity. Such a system is anti capitalistic, inequitable, and unsustainable. So, what was the term that Joseph Schumpeter coined? It was the term creative distraction, right? So Schumpeter's concepts of creative distraction captures this, which it means that economic progress comes from a ceaseless churning of firms and industries. In Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, which is the book he wrote that the industrial mutation incessant increasingly revolutionized the economic structure from within, destroying the old one, creating the new one, as quoted before. This process is painful because jobs have vanished and the company failed, but societies that allow it became richer. Attempts to soften the harshness by preserving jobs or protecting industries lead to stagnation and decline. Pain and gain are inseparable. You cannot reap the rewards of innovation without accepting losses, right? So the turnover of large corporations illustrates creative destruction and practice. Of the Fortune 500 companies listed in 1955, fewer than 1 in 8 remained on the list 60 years later. It means today, more than 88% have disappeared through bankruptcy, merger, or decline. This trend is accelerating. A report by Insight shows that corporation in the S&P 500 index stayed in the index of an average of 33 years in 1965. By 1980s, that tenure had fallen to 20 years. By 2012, it was 18 years, and it's projected to shrink to 14 years by 2026. So at the current run rate, about half of the S&P 500 firms will be replaced over the next decade. This is the market's immune system at work. Old giants die, making space for startups and innovation. So Trumpetarian churn benefits consumers and society. New entrants force incumbents to cut price, right, and improve quality. The EconLib encyclopedia, which I just previously said about that, notes that only 5 out of 100 largest public companies in 1917 were still in the top 100 by 2000. Half of the top 100 of 1970 had been replaced by 2000. This constant ruling reallocates resources from declining sectors to the growing ones. Without it, scarce capital would remain trapped in unprotected areas. So, as I said, and as I previously quoted from the NSI data show that by 2026, the average lifespan of a company, a big company, will have shrunk to barely over a decade. Such high turnover is a feature, not a bug. It means the system is flexible and responsive. So entrepreneurs introduce new products, technologies, and business models. They disrupt incumbents and create entirely new industries, from ride sharing and online streaming to fintech and renewable energies. So, um, and the economic piece, um, it's clearly written because the article emphasizes this, that the quote, the fundamental impulse that sets and keeps the capitalist engine in motion comes from new goods, new methods of production, new markets, and new forms of organization. So governments cannot design these innovations, right? They cannot do it centrally. At best, they can fund basic research and maintain an environment where entrepreneurs can experiment and fail. When the state shields incumbents from failure, it smothers this entrepreneur impulse. So to grasp the cleansing effects of the crisis, so picture a timeline of the past 3 decades, right? The dot-com bust in 2000, the global financial crisis which we had in 2008, the pandemic recession in 2020, and today's 2026 downturn. After each crash, a wave of disruptive companies emerged. Google and Amazon after the dot-com bust, Uber, Airbnb, and Tesla after 2008, a surge of digital health, remote work, and green tech startups after 2020. The crisis flushes out the weak and frees capital for the new. And governments are increasingly tempted to pursue that, what I call law of fragility. So the more you try to eliminate the small failures, the more catastrophic the eventual collapse will be. This law has three components, which are, first and foremost, it's a moral hazard multiplier, right? So each bailout multiplies risk taking. As the Atlantic Council notes, large depositors and investors now assume that when things go wrong, the government will come to rescue. Expectation of rescue are hardwired. I mean, encouraging leverage and speculative bets that wouldn't occur if losses were borne privately by preventing the insolvency of financial institutions today. Policymakers amplify systematic risk tomorrow. In 2020, guaranteeing all deposits at Silicon Valley Bank may have averted panic, um, but it signaled that uninsured depositors at other banks could expect the same treatment. The next crisis will be larger as more risk is piled on the assumptions and bailouts. So, number two is that zombie firms and we will have zombie firms and also productivity collapse. So, persistent intervention keeps unproductive firms alive, dragging down productivity. Japan's last decade and Europe's last decade is the 1990s decade, just for clearance. And Europe's 2010s illustrate how banks that refinance bad loans to avoid recognizing losses create legions of um, zombie firms. Studies show that the sectors benefiting from subsidies tend to have lower productivity than those that do not. An IMF blog on industrial policy warns that while targeted support can generate gains under stringent conditions, history is full of cautionary tales of policy mistakes, high fiscal costs, and negative spillovers. Subsidies misdirected toward politically connected sectors can be detrimental for productivity and welfare. When governments pick winners, they often entrench incumbents and block the market's natural selection. So, number three is that we will face um, an innovation turnover decline. So heavy-handed industrial policy reduces innovation turnover, right? The rate at which new firms replace old ones. That's the innovation turnover concept. It means that there will be, it's the rate which new firms actually replaces the old ones. So research analyzing more than 768,000 Chinese industrial policy documents found that policy imitation is common and costly. Flower cities that copied high-level policies experience lower firm revenue, profits, and productivity. Central planners emphasize subsidies for production, but imitation reduce incentives to experiment or tailor policies to local conditions. The same research note that industrial policies almost as most effective when local, tailored, and well coordinated, but risk inefficiency and duplication when driven by imitation, right? So countries with strict industrial policies often see declining entry rate and lower dynamism. The push for permanent stability doesn't just breed inefficiency, it hands a strategic control to the very states we fear. The IMF warns that industrial policy is not a magic cure for slow growth. Policies must avoid discrimination against foreign firms and must be carefully designed. Miscredited subsidies and protectionist measures can fragment global trade and slow innovation. In a world where economic competition defines geopolitical strength, closing markets under the guise of security is self sabotage.